to another meeting of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. We seem to be having a meeting pretty much every week now, and many of you come pretty much every week as well. So it's very nice to see you all here tonight. And tonight, it's my great privilege to be able to introduce Anna Lanyon to you. Anna is a very important person for us who are interested in Latin America and Australia, in that she's one of probably the only, perhaps, person who has written so much about particularly 16th century Mexico in Australia. And her first book, Malinche's Conquest, was the way that came to my attention originally, and it was an extremely well-received book, very well-reviewed. And she followed up by pursuing Malinche. Malinche, if you don't know, was the consort of Hernan Cortes, the Spanish conquistador and conqueror of Mexico. She followed that up by following Malinche's line to her son, Martin Cortes, and now another book which is largely, though not entirely, centred on Mexico, Fire and Stone. I had the luck of being sent a book before it actually appeared in the bookshelves, and was able to read a copy of this book, and I can certainly, without any reservation whatsoever, if you haven't got a copy, and they'll be on sale outside, if you haven't got a copy yet and you haven't read it, I can strongly recommend that you do so, because this is a book which is, I think, quite a rare kind of book in lots of ways. It's obvious when you read the book and when you look at the archives that Anna has gone through and so on, that this is a book which is based on absolutely painstaking historical research, and yet it certainly doesn't read like an academic tome. It's a book which really has the character, particularly of Luis de Carvajal, very much in mind. You get a real feel, not only for his personality, but for the times in Mexico, for the Inquisition, for the ideas which people had about religion, and for all sorts of, I think, human traits as well, foibles and contradictions and so on. And also for the way in which what happened to him was really a process of, in some ways, the times and the institutions, the oppressive institutions, the Inquisition of the time, but also, I think, of those contradictions, perhaps, to a certain extent, in what he was trying to do. So if I say any more, I'll talk too much about the book. So Anna's going to speak for, I think, about 40 minutes or thereabouts, and then she's available to answer questions or to listen to your comments, those of you who read the book or are interested in asking questions about the time or about the character. And after that, we have refreshments outside in the foyer, and Anna is happy to sign copies of the book should you wish to buy it. I can't think why you would not. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anna Lanyon. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and actually it's my honour and privilege to be here. It's wonderful. I love my visits to Canberra. Just on a really personal note, my mother, who's now 83 and in Melbourne, spent her childhood years in Canberra playing on the Molonglo Creek, she talks about, because her parents, my grandparents who were Irish, came up here, I think when the capital was first established. So I usually try and pay a little visit to her old house, her former house in Kingston, but I don't know if I'll have time this time. But we always grew up hearing from Mum these wonderful stories about Canberra, but of course it was more like an overgrown farm than the Canberra of now, which is such a sophisticated city. But anyway, it's lovely to be here. John, do you want to wave the flag to me when it's time to... or if I see people nodding off, I'll know it's time to stop talking and throw it over to you. Perhaps I'll just say a little bit more about myself. I'm actually an independent scholar, so I'm not, not an academic as such, but I do have a very warm and close relationship with La Trobe University in Melbourne, and particularly with the Institute of Latin American Studies. But not only that, with the History Department and also with the Archaeology Department, who've been great supporters of me over the years. Not just support in terms of library privileges and so on, but lots of moral support for those dreadful times when a writer thinks that she really shouldn't have started this project and she's never going to finish it. So it's lovely to have people like that. And my primary, the people I write for initially, the people, when I'm thinking about who am I writing for, I'm always thinking about general readers, by which I mean intelligent general readers, not specialist readers. However, having said that, I try to be as scholarly as I can be in terms of my process, in terms of my research. And when I write, I try not to, I simply don't ever join the gaps and make it up. If I don't know, I'll just tell you. I'll just tell the reader, we don't know at this point. Because I really don't like that, I'm personally not very fond of that blend of, what do they call it, faction, you know, fiction and fact. I just think readers, and I'm a reader of course, we are entitled to know what it is that we're reading. And if it's a novel, that's fantastic. If it's non-fiction, that's wonderful too, but I think we need to keep them separate. So that's the challenge for me. It's quite hard, I find it hard, to write books with a scholarly basis that do reach general readers. But I think I'm lucky in one respect, which is that I don't live in Melbourne or Sydney. I live in a very small rural city on the southern coast of Victoria called Portland, of about 10,000 people, and I've lived there and worked there for 30 years. And I always feel that I have to write something that my community can read, or most people in my community can read, and if I write something that they can't read, well, I just don't want to write something that they can't read. So when the guys in the drive-through bottle shop say, "How's the book going, love?" I'm very grateful, and I want those people to be able to read it. So they're sort of my benchmark, I guess. Now, to move away from me and onto the Carvajal case, and I know at least a couple of people here have read it because they told me before we came in this evening. The name Carvajal is actually not an uncommon name in Spanish, but the Carvajal case is quite famous in the annals of 16th century Mexico, and particularly in studies of the Mexican Inquisition. And also in studies of the secret Jews of Spain and Portugal, of whom, of course, there were many, except that we don't know how many because we only know about the ones who got caught. So we'll never know about the ones who managed to keep their heads down and did not get caught. It's famous, the Carvajal case, I guess it's famous for two reasons, really. One, because so many members of one family were involved. Luis was one of 9 siblings, and all but 2 of the siblings were prosecuted by the Mexican Inquisition, and also his mother. The other reason it's quite famous and unique is because although we have thousands of trial transcripts from inquisitions throughout Europe and Mexico and Peru, we have very few cases of those like Luis de Carvajal, where he left his own writings as well. He left his own accounts of his life. He left a little spiritual testament, which we'll look at shortly. I'm going to show you some little glimpses of the documents, okay? He left a spiritual testament that he wrote just 3 months before he died, or rather was killed, in which he set out his beliefs and said, you know, I'm sticking to them no matter what. I want to die in the law of Moses. He never ever said Judaism, never used the word, always referred to the law of Moses. And the other thing he left behind were letters that he wrote to his sisters while they were all in prison together in 1596. So to have this little treasure trove of personal writings on one side, and to have the trial transcripts on the other, not just Luis's, but his mother's and his sister's, and there are two trials of each member of the family. It's quite an extraordinary thing, so that's another reason the Carvajal case is quite famous among scholars and students of 16th century Mexico, and particularly the Mexican Inquisition. I should give you a brief outline of the story for those of you who haven't read the book, and I presume that's most of you. In a sense we could say it begins in 1492, when Fernando and Isabel of Spain conquered Granada and soon after issued an ultimatum to their Jewish citizens who had been in the country for millennia, that they must either convert to Catholicism or leave, go into exile. And once again, if we start talking numbers, we get into trouble, because historians range from extraordinarily extravagant figures to quite modest ones. But I think Henry Carman, who's a very meticulous and careful scholar of this era thinks that there were probably about 80,000 Jews in Castile and Aragon at that time, and about half left. Those who stayed had to convert. And there was a nasty subclause to the conversion situation, because a few years earlier the Spanish Inquisition had been established. The Inquisition had been established in Spain much later than all the other Inquisitions in Europe. Inquisitions only had jurisdiction over Christians. Inquisitions could not prosecute Jews or Muslims or anyone who was not a baptised Christian. So the trouble was, if you were baptised, if you converted and became a converso or new Christian, nuevo cristiano as they were called, then you found yourself in the situation where you could be prosecuted. So it was a very dangerous situation. I think this is not always, I didn't understand it until I was researching this book. It wasn't just a question of go into exile or stay. That other terrible lurking fear was, if I do stay and convert, I'm going to be very vulnerable to prosecution by the Holy Office. So it was a terrible decision for people to make. And one of the things that's not probably widely known is that many of those who left Spain actually came back. Some of them turned back along the road from Portugal or from Navarra, wherever they were heading, because it was just too terrible and too hard. And they were raped along the way, they were robbed along the way, they were murdered. But some continued to come back even years later, because even years after settling in other countries, they just missed their homeland, although it had been so cruel to them. They just missed it. So that's a whole other story. It's not part of Luis's story, but in some ways this is just the tip of the iceberg. So Luis's story starts in 1492 because his great-great-grandparents chose to convert. And the reason we know this, and it only plays a small part at the start of the book, is because although I began my research with the documents from the late 16th century, the 1580s and 90s in Mexico City, one of the things that Inquisitions did was they always collected genealogies of people, several generations back. Therefore, in reading the documents of Luis and his family in the 1590s in Mexico City, I was able to actually track back to the 1540s in Portugal, where I found another Luis de Carvajal, who was actually the great-granduncle of this Luis, who tells the story when he was arrested by the Inquisition in Portugal, who explains that his parents, Catalina and Alvaro, had been baptised in the little border village of Fermoselle in Spain. And that early Luis would have been about 5 at the time, so he was actually a child of that terrible era. But that's how I know that the family did make that choice to convert. I don't know whether they made it, overnight, or they agonised over it, or they may even have left. They might even have trudged across the border into Portugal, and then in fear they might have come back. We don't know, but we just know that that's what happened. Among the many Jewish families who did convert to try to stay in their homeland, it's also well documented that they weren't, having converted, they weren't unanimous. Many families were not unanimous in being secret Jews or in being faithful Catholics. And I know that was the case in Luis's family because actually terrible tensions broke out between them in Mexico. But I also know, going back through the records, things I just couldn't fit into the book, but I would have loved to. I mean, there's an Augustine, how do you say it in English? Augustinian monk. Augustinian monk. What do you say? Augustinian? Yes, sorry. I think of the order of San Agustin, yeah. Augustinian. Thank you for helping with my English. A Jesuit, Franciscan. So several of his male family members actually joined Catholic religious orders. Of course, that doesn't actually mean that they believed in their hearts in Catholicism. We can't know what's in someone's head, can we? Unless, like Luis, they write and tell us. But so I think his family was divided like many families were divided. And of course that caused terrible tension in families, because if you were trying to, let's say you were trying to keep out of trouble, keep your head down, the last thing you wanted was for a very fervent family member to land everybody in trouble by being too open in their clinging to their Jewish faith. And that certainly creeps into the story of Luis de Carvajal. Let me just make sure I'm not getting too ahead of myself. Yes, I am getting ahead of myself. But what I might just say for a moment before we do that, and then I do want to show you some of the documents. One of the reasons I set out to do this, to write this project, apart from being absolutely fascinated by the materials I was privileged to come across in Mexico, was because the great American historian of the Mexican Inquisition, Richard Greenleaf, who I believe is still alive but very, very old, I think now, once wrote that, this was in 1969, he actually wrote complaining that his fellow historians have the lamentable tendency to tabulate crimes and sentences from the Inquisition Index without actually reading the documents. And he went on to say that counting trial transcripts cannot tell us anything about the actual nature of heresy or the mental world of heretics. He specifically meant in 16th century Mexico, whether you're talking about Judaizers, which is what secret Jews were called, or Islamicizers, you know, Muslims who were forced baptized, but also many of them continued to cling to their faith in secret, and they were called Islamicizers. Luteranos was the general word for Protestants, Lutherans, not that they all were Lutherans, but that was the generic term. And Alumbrados, very interesting group of passionate Catholics actually, but whose passion and fervour was so great that it alarmed the Holy Office, who liked to keep everything very orthodox and straight and narrow. So I felt that Richard Greenleaf sort of tossed out a challenge to scholars and historians: stop just counting these things, get in and read them. And so that's what I've done. And the Carvajal case in particular offers us a wonderful opportunity to go deeply into that mental world of Judaizing heretics, at least in Mexico City at that time. Because during their trials, the family talk very openly about their daily lives, the foods that they ate, because they tried to cling to the Jewish dietary laws, although they weren't certain exactly about all of them. They tried to observe as many Jewish feasts as they could, but once again, they didn't know about all of them. They knew about Passover, what they always called the Feast of Saint Esther. They'd adopted the Christian term saint. They didn't ever say Purim. They knew about Yom Kippur, but they never used that word. They always said the Day of Penitence. So they talk about all of this. And one of the most moving moments I found in my research was when I was reading the trial document of Luis's younger sister Leonor, who was 21 the second time she was arrested. She actually sang a number of songs for the inquisitors over several hearings, and the scribe recorded them. So you can sit there and read them all. I'll just give you a few lines, a little flavour. Some of these songs, I think that Luis composed most of these songs, because the family was completely cut off from any formal Jewish education. No rabbis, no synagogues. Everything that they knew about the law of Moses, as they called it, they had gleaned for themselves from little bits of scripture here, little bits of scripture there. But Luis wrote some songs, and he based them on the Ten Commandments. And this is one of the ones that Leonor sang. I'll just say it in Spanish first and then in English. She sang this for the inquisitors. Yo soy tu Dios y Señor, que con poder infinito te liberté del Egipto, donde vivías con dolor y ásperamente aflicto. I am God, I am your God and Lord, who with infinite power liberated you from Egypt, where you lived in pain and terribly afflicted. So in that series of songs, the whole Ten Commandments are set out in verse. And Luis had apparently set them to music because he was actually teaching his mother and sisters the commandments, and by singing them, of course, they were able to retain them. Maybe at this point we should actually just have a look at some of the documents. Those of you who've got the book will know that many of these are reproduced. Oh, I don't have to turn around, isn't that good? This is actually the front sheet of the second trial transcript of Luis de Carvajal. And as you can see, the handwriting's beautiful. So once I got the hang of the handwriting, it wasn't too bad, translating these. Also, 16th century Spanish is not... modern Spanish has not changed as much as modern English has changed from 16th century English, if you see what I mean. So it's not too difficult. And also because these are legal documents, like all legal documents, they have a certain form and formula. Once you get used to the kind of cadence and the rhythms of the question, preguntado, answered, dijo, etc., it's not too hard. So that's Luis, mozo soltero, young man, reconciliado by this holy office, which means he had previously been reconciled, in other words, penanced, forgiven, for after his first trial. The problem was he couldn't, after that he could not stick to his promise to be a faithful Catholic. I've forgotten how to move on to the next one, John. Do I? How do I? Oh, of course. Thank you. Sorry. On the back of the book, for those of you who've got it, if I point, can people... Does that work? Ah, yes, it does. Luis also, he adopted the name Joseph Lombroso after his first trial and his first imprisonment. Joseph Lombroso, Joseph the Illuminated One, because he felt illuminated after his first experience of about a year in prison in the Mexican Inquisition. Rather than coming out reformed, in fact he came out more than ever impassioned by his love for the law of Moses, for his ancestral faith. And on several occasions during his second trial, at the end of every interrogation, prisoners were read by the scribe what they had said, or they could read it themselves, which he did, and then they could say whether they wanted to amend some of it, change it, and if they felt it was correct, they signed it to show that they felt it was the correct record. And there are some occasions like this one where Luis signed as Joseph Lombroso. And look at that beautiful signature. That's after a year in prison. And I think even the signature itself is defiant in its beauty, you know, that incredibly elegant J. And that was, he wrote that, the next hearing was on Monday 22nd of January 1596, so this was the previous day. Isabel was his eldest sister, who was really as passionate as he was. And if only, I wish Isabel had written something. Well, actually she probably did write things, but they have not survived the way his have. In a sense, it was Isabel and Luis who kept the family faithful to their forbidden religion, even in the face of death. The next one, I think, is Doña Leonor, his youngest sister, the one I just explained to you, who sang all those songs for the Inquisitors. She was 15 or 16, 15 the first time she was arrested, 20 the second time. Once again, this is the front sheet, okay? The actual document is around 300 parchments, so it's very fat. And if anyone's interested, on this front here, well, firstly up here it tells you about her, where she was born in Benavente, and that she was the wife of Jorge de Almeida, Portuguese, and that she was the daughter of Francisco Rodriguez de Matos and of Francisco de Carvajal. And down here it says, Judaizante relapsa, meaning she's a relapsed Judaizer, which was a fairly fatal thing to be. You could be a convicted Judaizer or Luterano or whatever once, not twice. Twice, like mandatory sentencing, I guess, you know. This is Doña Leonor, young Leonor's own signature. You see, not nearly as elegant as her brother, but her brother had been educated by the Jesuits as a little boy in Medina del Campo in Spain. So he was very well known in his lifetime for his writing, for his handwriting. People were always requesting him. Even one of the Inquisitors requested him to copy out some prayers for him in a little notebook because his hand was so beautiful. Doña Leonor, in fact, she says in her transcript she had only learnt to write a few years before this, so she only learnt to write as a teenager, an adolescent. This is very sad. This is one of the remaining little notes that she wrote to Luis when they were both in prison in 1595, sorry. They passed notes to each other which were intercepted by the jailer, who then took them to the Inquisitors. Leonor and Isabel's transcripts are now held in the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, in San Francisco. And you know, it's an incredible thing to sit there and take them out of the box and go through them. And Leonor's little notes are there, the ones she wrote to her brother. And in her very clumsy handwriting, she's written here, I'll give you a translation. Y si estoy acá, mis hermanas, por algún falso testimonio. And if my sisters are here by some false testimony, she's written. And that's all that remains of that scrap. So it's like mysterious because it's obviously just a few words out of a much longer message. Doña Francisca was Luis's mother. This is her first trial transcript from 1589. Her second one has gone missing. Some of the family's documents have gone missing, as a matter of fact. And we can only hope that they turn up one day. But the first one is in Mexico City, and this is the front sheet of it. Doña Mariana Núñez was another of Luis's sisters, slightly younger than him. And this is also her first trial. And Mariana had a very tragic life, actually, because from the descriptions that Luis gives of her, she had what we would probably describe now as a psychotic illness. She rants and she raves and she terrifies her family by throwing statues, holy Christian statues, out the window and smashing them, which of course is terrifying for them because they are afraid that people will understand that they're secret Jews. Mariana didn't die with her mother and her sisters and her brother in 1596 because she was crazy at the time. Her life was spared. But 4 years later, strangely enough, and when she was very lucid, she insisted on going to the Inquisition and giving herself up and confessing that she had once been a secret Jew. And she says in her testimony that her confessor, who was a Franciscan monk, tried to stop her, and he said, "Child, you don't have to do this. You know, you don't have to die to prove that you're a good and faithful Christian." But she absolutely insisted, and she went, and she was executed as well. This is Luis's little handwritten spiritual testament that he wrote 3 months before he was executed. That's the actual size. In the book, that size in the book is the actual size. So to read it, you need a magnifying glass. Or, of course, what I've done at home is I've photocopied and blown it up. Are we able to blow it up on? I suppose we can, can't we? Ah, there we are.
Keep going.
Yeah. So, and of course, it's tiny, tiny words. I think I counted them, and I think there are about 1,500. But this is his final testament. And it really is like a beautiful oration. It is really, in which he tells the inquisitors that no matter what, he is staying faithful to the law of Moses. And at the very end, beautiful, which is over the, next one, I should move it on. Because you have to flip the page, so to speak. Down here he signed it. I'll see if I can capture it. Well, hang on. I'm sorry, there it is. Joseph Lombroso. At the very end, he asks the Archangel Michael to come and help him die a good death. Because he says, I'm of flesh and fragile seed. He doesn't think he's as brave as he wants to be to die the kind of heroic death. So this little document is still in his trial transcript, also in Mexico City. One of the ironies of his story and his family story is that the people who tried to wipe them out preserved their memory. Luis wrote this and he presented it to the inquisitors in September 1596, and he asked them to place it with my papers so it will be there forever. And they did, and it is still there. Whether it stays forever, I don't know. So I just want to give you a little taste there of those. Maybe I should speak a little bit now about how I decided to actually write the book, given that I want to write for general readers, not purely for academics, although I do hope that academics find it useful, academics in the field find it useful. I've used a great portion of the trial transcripts verbatim, although I've translated them out of the Spanish, particularly of Luis's, but also of Leonor's, and with some portions of Isabel's. Because I really wanted to give general readers as much as I could the sense of not me just telling them the story and telling them what happened, but I wanted as much as possible for readers to try to hear Luis speaking, and try to hear Leonor speaking, try to hear Isabel, but also to hear the inquisitors speaking. The questions they asked and the interesting, excuse me, glass of water, conversations that went on. Some of you may know the book by Carlo Ginzburg, The Cheese and the Worms. Does anyone know that book? No? It's very good, very readable. It's actually about a miller in 16th century Friuli, about exactly the same time as this, who got in trouble with his local Inquisition, because Inquisitions were in Italy as well. And Carlo Ginzburg has done a wonderful, Cheese of the Worms is his book about the miller, Domenico Scandella, and he says it has Domenico Scandella's trial transcripts have a dialogic character. There's a real conversation going on here, an argument often, quite a strong argument. Carlo Ginzburg also noticed something that I noticed in Luis, that like Luis, Domenico Scandella the miller had been sort of concocting his own kind of religion. It was Christian, and it was a little bit like what the Cathars had been, their sort of theology, which they had sort of invented for themselves back in France. But like, I think Luis and Domenico Scandella had in common the fact that they almost liked being able to put their case to the inquisitors, because here at last were some theologians who they could argue with. Luis is actually cheeky enough that he actually says that at times. There are several times when he tells the inquisitors that they are the heretics, not him. And several times when, in fact, the inquisitors send two Jesuits, theologians, to talk with him, to try to plead with him and try to get him to change his mind and return to what he always calls the law of Jesus. The theologians spend several days, but in the end, they give up. And in fact, Luis has the cheek to tell the inquisitors next time that he was trying to convert them while they were trying to convert him. So Luis and that little Italian miller over in Italy at the same time, I think, had this similar thing, a great sense of their own power. So that's why I decided to use a lot of the transcripts verbatim, and I tried to give judicious commentary in and out and around, to tell people what was going on, to explain some things that they might not know. I think that if the book acquires an almost claustrophobic pace along the way toward the end, I'm sorry to do that to readers, but actually it's sort of what I was trying to do, in the sense that, the life that Luis was leading for that last 2 years of his life was pretty much in a cell, coming out every few days to undergo an interrogation and to argue with the inquisitors and to talk with Jesuit theologians. But so his life was very circumscribed, the last 2 years of his life. So it may be that when you're reading it, you'll feel that too. Oh, this is closing in on me. But in a sense, I don't mean to be sadistic, but I think I wanted us to feel that, if you understand what I mean. The other thing, of course, is why waste all that wonderful dialogue? I think it gives such an immediacy to the text to actually hear the voices. You can't hear them. I realise you can't hear them like you hear mine now, but it's almost like hearing voices. What time are we up to? I'll just have a sip. Are we going okay?
Yeah.
Have I got time to go back to Luis's childhood a little? You think I should do that? So Luis began his life as a good little baptised Catholic boy in Spain, along with his mother and father and his many sisters and 2 brothers. His eldest brother had become a Dominican monk, as a matter of fact. So he had turned his back on the family. Whether or not he really felt that the law of Moses was the correct faith or not, he may have thought it was correct faith and just wanted to not have to live a secret life, which would have been a terrible strain, or he may have been a completely convinced Catholic. We'll never know. So at the age of about 7 or 8, Luis and his brother Balthazar were enrolled in a brand new Jesuit school in the town of Medina del Campo, which is a town I love very much, quite small town in northern Spain. in the province of León y Castilla. The Jesuit order, of course, was very new at the time, and the Jesuits were one of the few, in fact the only order that openly admitted boys from Jewish or Islamic backgrounds. Most of the other orders by that time had begun to exclude anyone from the wrong ancestry. They did actually admit them, but under pretense of them having old Christian credentials. So in that school in Medina del Campo, Luis was only there for about 3 years, but I think it had a profound impact on him because there he learnt Latin. And of course Latin was the lingua franca of learning in Europe at the time. And that meant that when, at the age of 18, across the seas in Mexico, he was able to purchase his first ever Bible for 6 pesos. It was in Latin. It was the Vulgate Bible, the old translation by Saint Jerome from centuries earlier. Luis was able to begin to read it in Latin and to begin translating it into Spanish for his family and his friends, because these people, just like other Christians, because remember they were baptised Catholics, so they're sort of nominally Christians, like all other Christians in Europe at that time, were prohibited from reading the scriptures. Only ordained people could read the scriptures, which is one of the reasons for the Reformation, of course, that people wished to read the scriptures for themselves without the intervention of priests telling them what was in the Holy Book. So those years in Medina del Campo were very important for Luis, whether or not he knew it at the time. But it was also in Medina del Campo, while he was at the Jesuit school, that his family, and he tells us this himself, this is how we know, in his autobiography that he wrote. I'm not sure if I mentioned that before when I talked about his writings, but he wrote in a tiny little notebook, he wrote his autobiography, which he called his Book of Miracles. So Luis, at about the age of 10, about the age of bar mitzvah, was approached by his family, and they told him the truth, that in fact, although they lived as Catholics, they were actually Jews, and they hoped that he would join with them in following the true faith. And he says in his little Book of Miracles that he didn't hesitate for even one moment. It seems to have been fairly common, from what I've understood reading more broadly about the secret Jews of Iberia, that parents did not tell children their secret until this age, boys or girls, presumably because it was too dangerous to have a little one running around who might come out with things that would incriminate the family. And so around 10 was the age when children were often told the secret, at which point some of them probably did turn their back on the family, and others, like Luis, embraced the law of Moses straight away, as did his brother Balthazar, who was 2 years older than him. A few years later, Luis's uncle, who had been a very formidable and successful conquistador in Mexico, which was then called New Spain, arrived back on a visit to the old country. And he came back to gather around him friends and family who he had permission to take back with him to Mexico, because he hadn't quite conquered. He thought he had conquered the northern provinces of what is now Mexico, what's now the state of Nuevo León, which reaches up right to the Texan border. And he wanted to take people back to help him settle. So he persuaded Luis's mother and father to come with him and bring their children. And they thought that they were going to a fairly luxurious life, a better life in the New World, with the new governor of Nuevo León. And they probably thought they would live in luxury, and they certainly would have thought, I think, that they would get away from a lot of the fear that they were living in every day in Spain. So they sailed across the ocean with him and settled in an absolutely, from their point of view, God-forsaken outpost called Tampico, which is now a lovely, booming, happy port city in northern Mexico. But when they arrived, it was just a huddle of mud flats and villages and otters and mosquitoes. They're always talking about this, what a dreadful place it was. And straight away, tensions developed in the family. Firstly, because of where they had been brought to. They felt they'd been tricked by Francisca's brother. But secondly, because having settled there, Luis's elder sister Isabel, whose transcript you saw, set about trying to drag her uncle the governor back to the law of Moses, because she had promised his wife before they left Spain that she would do this. And that caused an absolute uproar in the family, from which the family never really recovered in terms of their own relations with each other. Terrible division between the uncle and Francisca, her husband, young Luis, his brothers and sisters. So in a way, that was sort of the beginning of the end, really. It's interesting how, I was just going to say, that's right, hindsight, we talk about, just in daily life, don't we? We talk about the benefit of hindsight. Can be a benefit, but it can also be a danger, I think, particularly when we're trying to read and write about the past, in that because something happened or it ended up like this, we think it was inevitable. It must have been going to happen because that's the way it ended. But I think that's not always true. We're sort of reading too much into the end result. One of the, I think, the Carvajal story appears to have the kind of inevitability of a Greek tragedy, where we have this poor family trudging towards their doom. But it probably didn't have to be that way. Contrary to many of our assumptions, because, even though Professor Greenleaf didn't approve of it, because we can count and tabulate Inquisition documents, we do know that the majority of Inquisition trials were of mundane things like blasphemy, bigamy. Priests were often in trouble for all kinds of things, including solicitation in the confessional. Heresy trials made up about 16% of the trials, and most of them did not end in death sentences. About 1% did. So, although the poor Carvajal family did pay the ultimate price, if they had not, it was their great love and their great passion for their faith that led them, unfortunately, to the end. And please don't think I'm blaming the victims there. I'm not at all. They were living in a terrible situation, a terrible framework, which I hope none of us here have ever had to live in, and I hope none of us ever will. But it was, in fact, the governor, that's Francisca's brother, it was his political problems with the viceroy that actually led to their initial downfall and then their later downfall. The history of Spanish colonial history is just full of conquistadors who got a bit above themselves and had to be taken down by the crown. And he was one of them. But in this particular instance, this family actually has, you could write another book about this family which just explores their activities in slavery, not just in the New World, but in Africa as well. And not just this immediate family, but many of their broader family, uncles, and so on. Luis's uncle, the governor in Nueva Leon, was a fairly enthusiastic slaver of the indigenous people, the Huasteca people of northern Mexico. You might be surprised to know that this was actually against the rules of the Spanish crown, because in 1541 they'd issued what they called their new laws, nuevas leyes, prohibiting the enslavement of indigenous people. Of course, it was easier to make the law than it was to make it work, but some viceroys went out of their way to try, and one viceroy in Peru was actually beheaded by colonists for trying to stick to the letter of the law. So it was with the governor, Luis's uncle. He was accused of enslaving people from a particular village, Huasteca village in the north. And whether or not that was just an excuse on the viceroy's part, because the governor had been giving him grief for some years, but it was certainly a legitimate excuse to have him arrested. Now, back to the hindsight thing. A few writers have written about the Carvajal family, and there's been this story that the governor was arrested by the viceroy on the basis of his Jewish ancestry. I can find no evidence of that whatsoever. There's a story that someone told someone that actually his family background was Jewish. And I've tracked, as you do, all the footnotes, tracked to where it's coming from, and all I can find is like a folkloric chronicle written in the 19th century in Nueva Leon. So It may be true, but there's no evidence for it. But there is definitely evidence for the fact that he was breaking the law according to the Spanish crown. So the governor was arrested, but not by the Inquisition, arrested by the viceroy and put in the viceregal cells. And soon after, the dominoes began to crumble within the family. Luis and his brother Balthazar, in fact, decided that as things were getting a little bit close for comfort, the family decided altogether that the boys, the young men of the family, should flee, go to the coast, take a ship to Spain, and then go on to Europe, maybe to somewhere like Ferrara or to Salonika, and where they could live in a Jewish community, and then they would send for the other members of the family. The young men did ride to the coast from Mexico City to Veracruz, and some of you probably know what a long distance that is, and the high mountains you have to pass through to get there. Having got to the coast, having found a ship, having put their belongings on board, they hesitated. And this happens so often in the Carvajal family. They're always about to leave and something stops them. And Balthazar and Luis hesitated because they couldn't bear to think that they'd left their mother and sisters back in Mexico City unprotected. So they went back. And when they went back, Luis and his mother were arrested by the Inquisition, because by that time it had come to the notice of the Inquisition that in fact the family had been Judaizing, and so that's the beginning of their first trial, their first imprisonment from 1589 to 1590. Francisca, the mother, is arrested, Luis is arrested, his Dominican brother Gaspar is arrested and marched across the Plaza de Santo Domingo. Does anyone know Mexico City? Yeah, you know the Plaza de Santo Domingo. Dominican monastery and church is still there, and the house of the Inquisition is here. So Gaspar was taken from his cell and marched across, imprisoned in an Inquisition cell. And then Isabel was arrested. Balthazar was not arrested at this point. He went into hiding, thankfully, in Mexico City. And so the trials began, and they ensued for about a year, the trials of the various family members, the transcripts, the interrogations and so on. But at the end of it all, the family were released because they had all agreed to stop Judaizing and to embrace the law of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ the Redeemer, they always say, and including Luis. And they took part in an auto de fe in the great plaza, the Zócalo, in Mexico City, in the cathedral. Auto de fe means act of faith, as you probably know. And during the act of faith, their heinous religious crimes were read out, and they each took an oath promising that from now on they would never stray from the path again of the Holy Mother Church. They would, from now on, be true Catholics, and they were all released. Not only that, not released into the community yet, but I guess what we might call house arrest. Francisca and her sisters, her daughters rather, were settled in a little house on another great famous plaza in Mexico City, the Plaza of Tlatelolco, Santiago Tlatelolco. Luis initially was in a monastery, the Hospital de San Hipólito, but they were brought together soon after. And if they had to stay there for 4 years, and they had to receive religious instruction. And if they could possibly have kept their heads down and, on the outside at least, observed, the law of Jesus Christ, they probably would have survived. They probably could then have taken ship, and they could have got back to Spain, or lots of could haves. It didn't happen. And the main reason it didn't happen was, in a sense, it was Luis, and I think this is something that some readers will find it difficult. I know one journalist who has interviewed me found it very difficult to sympathise with him, because when he went to live with his mother and sisters in the house in Tlatelolco, he was horrified to find that they were eating pork, eating bacon and so on, and they were going to Mass and doing all this. And he tells us himself he worked very hard to persuade them to return to the true faith, the law of Moses. And he did persuade them, and they did go back to it. But still, they almost still got away, because at the end of the 4 years, just as their period of house imprisonment was coming to an end, when they could have left the country, Luis and another of his friends feared that a particular friend was very ill and dying, and this friend, like them, was someone of Jewish ancestry, but he was living his life as a Catholic, that they so feared for him that he would die in the wrong faith, because they were so inculcated with Christian ideas that Luis and his friend tried very hard to bring this man on his deathbed back to the law of Moses. He completely repudiated them, I presume with some anger, even though he was very, very ill. And unfortunately, when he recovered, he went to the Holy Office and denounced them. So having just finished their 4 years period of reconciliación, it was called, reconciliation, they were all arrested once again. And they spent the next 2 years in prison. And this is when Luis writes his wonderful letters to his sisters and when he wrote his spiritual testament. The little autobiography he wrote, I should have explained this before, this is the trouble with not reading notes, you see. He had all those 4 years he'd been keeping his little journal, the story of his life, he says, from my days in Medina del Campo until the end of my wandering. Well, the end of his wandering came to an end in Mexico City, right on the edge of the Alameda Gardens, once again for those of you who know Mexico City, in what's now a very beautiful and peaceful place. But it was then the burning place for heretics. And I think the only other thing I'd probably like to say is, am I coherent? I hope I haven't confused everybody. I think, thank you. Thanks for coming. I think of some of my dear friends and colleagues back at La Trobe in particular were hoping, when I started out on this work about 6 years ago, they were hoping it would all be about economics and it would all be about, respectable subjects. And I think there might even be a sense of shock and disappointment that it's actually about religion. But it is. And that's one of the things, I suppose, that Professor Greenleaf was talking about don't just count. You count and you say, oh, look, there were that many heresy trials and that many trials for blasphemy and that many for bigamy. It doesn't tell us anything about what people were actually thinking. So I think they've got over I hope they've got over their disappointment, my dear friends at La Trobe. And they keep asking me about the mercantile networks of the Carvajal family, which were very wide and intricate. And I keep saying, yes, they were very wide and intricate, and I could write another book about them. But this book is not about their mercantile networks. It's actually about their mental world, their spiritual world. And I think that they're beginning to accept that this is the way it is. But that is, I think, one of the things, about actually reading the documents and not making assumptions that, oh, it must be. In fact, I do remember a seminar I gave at La Trobe a few years ago, and one person who actually is not familiar with this field of study said at the end, oh, I think it's all about economics, nothing to do with religion. So, anyway. What I would probably just like to end up by saying, and then we can have a conversation if you like, there was a lovely quote from a much more, here it is. Some of you may be familiar with the work of a modern historian, Timothy Snyder, who's been doing some extraordinary work on what he calls the bloodlands of Eastern Europe during and after the Second World War. So he's talking about the victims of the Nazis, but also the victims of the Soviet world. And I hesitate in a way to make a comparison. This is what he says. The barbarism of mass killing is to turn people into numbers. It is for us to turn the numbers back into people. So I guess it ties in a little bit with what Professor Greenleaf was saying. Let's just not count the numbers and let's try to find who the people were. I hesitate a little bit about comparing the mass killings of Stalin and Hitler with the Inquisition's activities, because certainly in terms of numbers there's absolutely no comparison. But of course in terms of the nature of the beast there are comparisons. But I hope with the book I've at least been able to do that, to there are thousands of these documents, but to take one family at least and try to pull them back from the underworld so that we remember them. Particularly because when they were sentenced to death at the end in December 1596, their sentences were all read aloud, one by one, and by the notary, who read out that, you know, let's say Leonor de Carvajal will be garroted, and after her death her body will be burned to cinders until no memory of her remains. And the same wording for each of them, same for Luis, until no memory of him remains. And I do remember the day I read the first of those sentences and my heart absolutely thumping, and, you know, having that sense that it's not just up to me, that would be very arrogant, but we must not let these people's memory disappear. So I hope in a little way the book will bring them back from oblivion. And I think that's about all I have to say for the minute.